The Getty family horror is a jaw-dropping story about a young man, John Paul Getty III, who lived a life of privilege and suddenly found himself in a nightmare. He was just 16 years old, living in the beautiful city of Rome, and being the grandson of one of the richest men in the world. But on one fateful day in 1973, everything changed. What would happen when he crossed paths with the dangerous Italian Mafia? How does someone go from luxury to captivity in the blink of an eye? Join us as we uncover the shocking details of his kidnapping by the Italian Mafia and the events that followed afterward. The kidnapping of John Paul Getty III. John Paul Getty III was living a seemingly normal life in Rome as a 16-year-old who loved hanging out with his friends and enjoying his freedom. But one evening, while walking home alone, everything changed. It was a quiet summer night on July 10, 1973. When 16-year-old John Paul Getty III was grabbed by a group of men in the Piazza Farnese in Rome. The hour was late, around 3 a.m., and the streets were almost empty. These men were members of the 'Ndrangheta, a notorious mafia family in Italy. They had one goal: to kidnap Getty and demand a huge ransom from his wealthy grandfather, J. Paul Getty. Paul, the grandson of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, was living a carefree life in Rome, dabbling in modeling with his girlfriend, Martine Schmidt, but money was tight. At one point, Paul had even joked about getting himself kidnapped as a way to get money from his billionaire grandfather. The idea seemed absurd, something only a rebellious teenager would dream up. But eventually, Paul decided against it, preferring to earn his living honestly. Yet even after he abandoned the idea, someone else had listened. Unbeknownst to him, a group of criminals had their eyes on him. Could he have sensed that danger was lurking, watching his every move? Blindfolded, frightened, and transported far from Rome, Paul was imprisoned in a dark cave in Calabria. His captors wasted no time, sending a ransom note to the Getty family. The kidnappers demanded $17 million. Why so much? Because they knew his grandfather was incredibly rich. But instead of paying immediately, Getty's grandfather decided to play hardball. J. Paul Getty, Paul's grandfather, suspected the whole thing was a stunt. He thought his grandson had staged the kidnapping to get money out of him, so he refused to pay. In his mind, paying the ransom could set a dangerous precedent. He famously said, "I have 14 other grandchildren, and if I pay 1 penny now, then I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." While Paul's family hesitated, the young teenager remained trapped in a cave. Time dragged on, and his situation worsened. His captors started treating him more harshly. They took away the tiny comforts he had, like a radio that had been his only connection to the outside world. Even worse, they killed a bird Paul had adopted as a pet. Tensions rose. The kidnappers began tormenting him by playing a terrifying game of Russian roulette with a gun pressed against his head. To make matters worse, a second ransom demand was sent, but it got delayed due to a postal strike in Italy. As the weeks turned to months, Paul's hope of rescue faded. His family didn't know if he was alive or dead. The kidnappers grew desperate to prove they were serious, so they took a drastic step that shocked everyone. By November 1973, the kidnappers decided to send a gruesome message. A daily newspaper received an envelope containing a lock of Paul's hair, a human ear, and a chilling note. The letter read, "This is Paul's first ear. If within 10 days the family still believes that this is a joke mounted by him, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." Could you imagine the panic that gripped the family when they received that package? The kidnappers weren't playing games anymore. Paul's family was finally forced to acknowledge that this was real, and if they didn't act soon, Paul's life could be in danger. While Paul waited for rescue, his health took a drastic turn for the worse. The wound from his severed ear became infected, and he developed pneumonia. As his condition deteriorated, his captors scrambled to keep him alive. They pumped him full of penicillin to fight the infection, but the treatment backfired. Paul had an allergic reaction, which only worsened his health. To numb his pain and keep him warm in the cold cave, his captors began giving him large amounts of brandy. Little did they know, this would contribute to a lifetime of problems for Paul, as he eventually struggled with alcoholism in later years. The negotiation and release of John Paul Getty III. With the shocking delivery of Getty's ear, the gravity of the situation set in. The kidnapping was no longer just a terrible story, it was a desperate fight for survival. J. Paul Getty finally realized he couldn't wait any longer. Time was running out, and the more time that passed, the more danger his grandson faced. So what could he do? Getty's grandfather, in his heart, wanted to pay whatever it took to bring his grandson back. But he was also a businessman. He knew the world of deals and contracts and thought about the implications of paying the ransom. Would it encourage more kidnappings? Would it put his other grandchildren at risk? These thoughts swirled in his mind as the negotiations began. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., decided to pay part of the ransom. However, true to his stingy reputation, he would only part with $2.2 million, which is the exact amount that could be written off on his taxes. The rest? Well, that was up to Paul's father. He had to take out a loan from his father to cover the remaining ransom, with the added burden of paying it back at 4% interest. Could you imagine that? Even when his grandson's life was at stake, J. Paul Getty Sr. saw an opportunity to profit. The ransom was finally paid, and on December 15, 1973, after more than 5 months in captivity, Paul was found alive at a petrol station in Lauria, a small town in southern Italy. Weak, traumatized, and missing an ear, Paul was set free, but the ordeal wasn't over just yet. As soon as he was safe, Paul's mother urged him to call his grandfather and thank him for paying the ransom. After everything he had been through, this might have been the moment when the family came together, where a grandfather would offer words of comfort to his suffering grandson. But that wasn't J. Paul Getty Sr. style. When Paul made the call, his grandfather refused to come to the phone. How could someone be so heartless? The man with enough money to save his grandson from the start couldn't even offer him a few minutes of conversation. The hunt for the kidnappers. The aftermath of Paul's release led to an intense investigation. 9 of the kidnappers were eventually caught, including two high-ranking members of the 'Ndrangheta, Giulio Pierlamali and Severo Mamaliti, notorious figures in Calabria's organized crime syndicate. The 'Ndrangheta was a powerful and feared criminal organization, and they had orchestrated Paul's kidnapping with chilling precision. However, justice was only partially served. Despite the evidence, most of the kidnappers were acquitted due to a lack of sufficient proof. How could these criminals get away with such a horrifying crime? Only 2 of the kidnappers were convicted and sentenced to prison. As for the 'Ndrangheta bosses, they walked free, and their involvement was never thoroughly punished. What about the ransom money? Most of it vanished without a trace. Despite the vast sum paid, only a fraction of the money was recovered. The criminals had disappeared with their payday. It seemed that Paul's suffering had all been for nothing. In the end, the Getty family was left with scars, both physical and emotional, that would last a lifetime. Could the tragedy have been avoided if his grandfather had acted sooner? Or was this a painful reminder that wealth and power don't always provide the security we expect? What happens next? As the months passed, Paul tried to find a new normal. Paul found love in 1974, just 1 year after his harrowing ordeal. He married Gisela Martin Zacher, who was 5 months pregnant then. However, they eventually divorced in 1993. In 1977, Paul Getty underwent plastic surgery to rebuild the ear that his kidnappers had cruelly severed. The pain of the moment would never fully leave him, but at least this surgery gave him back a tiny part of what had been taken. It must have been a bittersweet relief for Paul. His family name or his tragedy didn't just define Paul. For a while, he explored acting, appearing in a few European films like Raul Ruiz's The Territory and Wim Wenders' The State of Things. The effects of Paul's kidnapping were too deep to escape. He began to spiral into a life filled with drugs and alcohol, trying to numb the pain. In 1981, everything took a tragic turn. Paul consumed a deadly mix of Valium, methadone, and alcohol, which caused liver failure and led to a massive stroke. The once free-spirited young man was left quadriplegic, partially blind, and unable to speak. His mother became his full-time caregiver after this devastating event, even suing his father to cover the $28,000 a month needed for Paul's medical expenses. Though he regained some limited independence by 1987, he managed to ski while strapped to a metal frame. Paul never fully recovered. Paul's life ended on February 5, 2011, at his father's estate in Buckinghamshire, England. After years of struggling with his health following the overdose in 1981, Paul passed away at the age of 54. His life had been filled with highs and lows, and the trauma of his kidnapping seemed to cast a long shadow over every moment. The story of Paul Getty III is shocking and sad. He moved from being a cheerful lad with comfort to being kidnapped by the Italian Mafia. After being released, his life only continued to spiral downward. Could things have been different if his grandfather had acted sooner? Or was Paul's fate sealed when he was taken? What do you think? Let us know down in the comment section below. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.